This is a 1987 Mercedes-Benz 190E 2.3-16, and it's the fast Mercedes before there really were fast Mercedes. Back before AMG and twin-turbo V8s, this thing came out around the same time as the E30 BMW M3 in the late 1980s. It had a manual transmission and more power than the standard 190E, and today I'm going to review it. I've borrowed this 190E from a viewer here in the San Diego area, and I'm going to start with a very quick history lesson. Now, in the 1970s and the 1980s, AMG and Mercedes were two separate companies. AMG was just a tuning company that did their own thing. They built their own stuff. Mercedes and AMG didn't start working together until the early 1990s, and Mercedes didn't buy AMG until 1999. Now, before that, when Mercedes wanted to build a performance car, they did so on their own, and there are some very memorable Mercedes performance cars from this period. You had the 300 SEL 6.3 in the 1960s, you had the 450 SEL 6.9 in the 1970s, and in the early 90s, Mercedes came out with the 500E that was co-developed with Porsche. And then there was this. Now, the 190E was the entry-level Mercedes-Benz sedan of the 1980s and the early 1990s. It was essentially the C-Class before they started calling it the C-Class, and the 2.3-16 was the high-performance version, so named because it was a 2.3-liter four-cylinder with 16 valves. It was partially developed by British engineering firm Cosworth. Now, the 2.3-16 had 167 horsepower and 162 pound-feet of torque. Here in North America, it was about 20 horsepower less than European versions. And it did 0 to 60 in around 8 seconds, which is pretty good for a sports sedan of its day. The 2.3-16 was built as the watered-down road version of a race car that was competing in the DTM touring car race series, and it was sort of the base model of the fast 190E versions. There was also a 2.5-16 model that had around 200 horsepower that was sold in Europe, and then there were evolution models with even more horsepower and with big wings. Those are really rare and really valuable. Nice 190E Evo models can sell for over $200,000. But the 2.3-16 was the only fast 190E that was ever offered in North America. So today I'm going to review the 2.3-16, and I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of the sporty Mercedes sedan before the C63 and E63 and all the other modern stuff. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the 2.3-16, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of some of the cool 1980s performance car bargains currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features on the inside of the 2.3-16 with the first thing you notice when you climb in this car, and that would be the shift lever. First off, it's unusual to see a manual shift lever in any Mercedes-Benz, but this was a sporty car and it was a different time, and this one is a manual, a true 3-pedal manual. But the odd thing about this shift lever isn't that it's there, it's the shift pattern. This has a dog leg transmission, which means that first is down and to the left rather than up and to the left. Instead, up and to the left, you have reverse. Now, the theory here is that second and third are the gears that you're going to be going between when you're on a racetrack going through the corners, and so Mercedes-Benz wanted those gears to be in a straight line so you could switch between them quicker than in a normal transmission, and so that's why you have the dogleg. But the big question you probably have is, what happens if you accidentally put the shift lever up and to the left to go to first gear? Will you accidentally shift into reverse? No, Mercedes-Benz thought of that. There's a lockout. In order to get it into reverse, you actually have to pull up on the shift lever and then move it up and to the left to prevent that exact thing from happening. Now, next up, another interesting item. Directly in front of the shift lever on the center control stack, you have 3 gauges. And the gauge on the left is oil temperature, no surprise. The gauge on the right is the battery voltmeter. But what's that one in the middle? Well, that's the lap timer. This was the sporty performance car. It was the neutered version of the race car. You were supposed to take it on the track, and so it came with a lap timer. Now, this is common in a lot of performance cars today, but back then, nothing had a lap timer in it. But the 2.3-16 did. Now, another interesting item you'll notice in this vicinity is the power mirror control, which is directly in the middle in the center console in front of the shift lever. And you can just move it around like a normal power mirror control, no surprise, but there's only one. You can't shift between left and right. So what's the deal with that? Well, that's the passenger power mirror control. The driver power mirror control didn't exist. The driver mirror was manual, only the passenger mirror was power, but I guess that made sense. You could easily adjust the driver mirror. The passenger mirror, otherwise you'd have to get out and go over there. This was a luxury car and they couldn't have that, so there is a power control just for one mirror. And speaking of the mirrors on this car, one of the most interesting quirks of Mercedes-Benz models from this era, the mirrors are different sizes. You can see the mirror on the driver's side is sort of more horizontal, sticking out from the door panel and the A-pillar. The mirror on the passenger side is more vertical. This was to account for different sized blind spots. On the driver's side, you wanted a more horizontal mirror to look at that blind spot, but on the passenger side, you wanted a larger, more vertical field of vision to look at that blind spot. Mercedes-Benz affixed different sized mirrors to its vehicles for a long time throughout the 1980s to account for this, although they don't still do that. And next up, this car has power seats, no surprise. This wasn't just a sporty car, but also a luxury one. The interesting thing is, though, there's a separate little power control in the power seat control area on the door panel. That one is for the power headrest. Yes, this car had power headrests, which was uncommon except in really high-end luxury cars back then, but the 2.3-16 had it. Next up, another interesting item. Most modern cars have check engine lights to let you know something is wrong in your emission system under the hood. This is mandated by the government now. It has been since the 90s, but this car is before that, and so it has a separate light for oxygen sensors. It has an O2 sensor light. There isn't just a check engine light, but just one to let you know an oxygen sensor was malfunctioning, sort of an early predecessor to the check engine light. Next up, moving on to the stereo, a couple of interesting items with the stereo controls, starting with the fact that you have 10 presets in this car, but they're separated between FM and AM presets. You have 6 FM presets and 4 AM presets. Now, this was actually relatively common years ago in older cars, but is rather unusual for a modern vehicle to separate FM and AM presets out, but they did in the 190E. Another interesting item with this stereo head unit, the volume switch, and although a volume knob is actually more useful and convenient for turning up and down the volume, this volume switch is so satisfying to flip up or down. It seems to be a rather simple act just to change the volume in your stereo, but when you have a volume switch like that, it's also a joy. Next up, another interesting item with the antenna in this car. Now, like a lot of cars from this era, when you turn on the radio, the antenna on the trunk automatically goes up into its up position to get better radio reception. That was not particularly uncommon at the time. The uncommon thing about this car is you can actually control the antenna yourself. There's a little switch at the top of the dashboard. You can put the antenna up or down if for whatever reason you want it to be up or down. Now, this is especially good attention to detail because if you turn on the radio and put in a cassette tape, the antenna will go up thinking that the stereo's on, so it has to be up. But you don't want the antenna up. It's ugly. You don't need the reception because you're listening to a cassette tape. So you can push the switch to the off position and the antenna will automatically go down, and thus it won't clutter the fine lines of your car when you don't need the antenna. Now, a couple of other interesting switches. To the left of the steering wheel, you can see there's a switch that turns on a light. That actually turns on the rear dome light over the back seat. So if the rear passengers ask you nicely enough to turn on their light, you can do that with a control up here. Interestingly, the rear passengers have no control over that dome light. There isn't a switch in the back seats, only one in the front, so the driver can decide when the rear passengers need to be illuminated. Now, next up, back to lighting for a second. There is a dome light in the ceiling of this car. That's no surprise. A lot of cars have that, but there's also a reading light. Now, this too is no surprise. A lot of cars have that as well, but in this car, there is only a reading light for the passenger side. You can turn it on and it illuminates the passenger side seat so the passenger can read a map while the driver drives. The driver does not have a reading light, presumably because the Germans felt you should not be reading while driving, you should be focused on driving. Leave that to your passenger. Next up, another interesting item in this car. Again, in the center console, you have the ashtray. Now, when you push it, it opens like a normal ashtray, but it has a cool little feature. It opens, and then when it's fully open, the actual cigarette lighter pops up to be pointed towards the occupants of the car. It's not always popped up, it's not always facing down. Instead, it actually moves up when you open the ashtray for your convenience. That is Mercedes-Benz attention to detail. Now, next up, we move on to the gauge cluster in this car. This is a fairly typical 1980s Mercedes-Benz gauge cluster, nothing particularly unusual or interesting here. Although there are two items that I think are worth noting for people who don't spend a lot of time in 1980s Mercedes models. One is the economy gauge. Now, cars today have triple trip meters and all these computers that show all these different fuel economy stats. Well, this thing just had a little gauge, and when you floored it, it went red, and when you got off the gas pedal, it went into black to let you know you were driving economically. It measured your current fuel economy at that moment, but not in actual numbers, just in sort of a dial that gave you a general sense of how economically you were driving. I also like the little dots in the speedometer. You can see there's one dot at like 35, there's another at like 55, etc. Those were the shift points. That was where you were intended to shift for full acceleration. If you were flooring it and going all out, you would shift when you hit those little dots in order to produce peak power, and then you moved on to the next gear. That was an interesting feature of some older manual cars that obviously you don't really see all that much today. Finally, one other item I want to note while I'm up here, this steering wheel, you've probably seen in a couple of shots, this is not a factory stock steering wheel. This is an aftermarket AMG steering wheel that the owner put on this car. It's one of only a couple of modifications to this vehicle. This is what the actual 190E 2.3-16 steering wheel looked like, far more normal, traditional, typical of a Mercedes-Benz from this era. Now, next up, I want to move into the glove box, and specifically into the owner's manual pouch, which has a couple of interesting items in it, including my favorite item, an explanation of the Mercedes-Benz roadside assistance program. Just look at the pictures. Look at this old 300TE 124 station wagon that is providing service. I absolutely love it. This man in a suit has broken down, and he's on the phone with this other guy who has a red phone because he's an emergency guy, and he's got clocks that say Eastern and Central, so he always knows what time it is. And then some other man shows up in this Mercedes wagon, and they fix his car, and he's on down the road, and everybody is happy. But I especially like this roadside assistance card you get with a W124 E-Class station wagon on it, just to show you how the roadside assistance service vehicle would look when it shows up to help you if you're stranded in your Mercedes-Benz. A couple of other interesting items in the owner's manual pouch. One is the Mercedes-Benz of North America dealership directory, and there's a map on the cover of it that shows where all the Mercedes dealers are. I was looking at this map, and it's actually kind of ridiculous. There are 4 dealerships in North Dakota, but only 1 in Utah. How did that happen? How did Mercedes-Benz get into that situation? Utah is like 6 times the population of North Dakota. I guess they didn't think Utah people were going to be buying Mercedes-Benz. Now, next up, I move into the back seat of the 2.3-16. The first thing you notice when you get back here is there's not really all that much room. I had to move the front seat pretty far forward just to be able to sit back here, and I still don't have all that much space. This was a smaller car. Cars in general were smaller back in the 80s, and this car is from a different era, and it shows. Now, the other thing you immediately notice when you climb back here is the rear seats and just how insanely bolstered they are. This was the performance car. You were supposed to take it on the track, and apparently you could take it on the track with people in the back, because this car has almost as much seat bolstering in back as it does in front. I've seen cars with some seat bolstering in back, but this is absolutely crazy. These really heavily bolstered seats in case you were going on family outings on the racetrack. Now, the result of these really heavily bolstered seats is that there's no middle seat. So the 2.3-16 was a 4-seater car. You couldn't get a middle seat in here, but you did have a nice center armrest, so rear seat passengers had somewhere to rest their arm as you were driving them around on the racetrack. Next up, another interesting item back here. The 2.3-16 had only 3 options that you could choose: heated seats, a sunroof, and rear headrests. And the owner of this car told me that almost no one chose the rear headrests. And so this is a rare 2.3-16 that actually has rear headrests. Next up, moving outside of the 2.3-16, a couple of interesting items worth noting. One is the color. Now, the 2.3-16 was sold in North America only for the 86 and 87 model year, and Mercedes-Benz offered only 2 colors. There was black, or there was this, which Mercedes called smoke silver, but which is actually like a light gold. And I just find this to be absolutely hilarious, because imagine today if Mercedes-Benz rolled out a high-performance car and they only offered it in black or gold. It's ridiculous to even think about, but back in the 80s it was acceptable, and so Mercedes did it. And the other thing Mercedes-Benz did was a body kit. Now, this car came out in Europe in the early to mid 1980s, before the E30 BMW M3, and there wasn't really a market for this car. There hadn't been other little performance luxury cars. Mercedes didn't know what their customers would want, so they tried. They put on this lower cladding to make the car a little bit more aggressive. You have these extensions over the wheel arches that do the same thing, and then you also have this rear wing. Of course, the E30 M3 came out later, some say as an answer to this car, and it had even more more flared fenders and an even bigger wing, and that sort of touched off this race of putting on more stylistic modifications that were subtle yet obvious on performance cars like this. Next up, another interesting item on the outside of this car is the badging. Now, I mentioned before that Mercedes-Benz badges from this era, they have the model name underlined in an attempt to appear classy, but actually it saves Mercedes-Benz money because they can put all of the letters and numbers on one badge rather than sticking on each one individually like they do now. But the 2.3-16 had an issue. There was a dash in the model name. So what did they do? Well, they made up a 2.3-16 badge all underlined, and then the dash is floating. It's separate there. Sometimes you will see 2.3-16 cars on the road with no dash at all. That part fell off, but the rest of it stayed. And next we move into the trunk of the 2.3-16. Where you can see it looks like a fairly standard trunk with a couple of interesting things. One is this warning triangle. This warning triangle I don't think was standard on the North American models, but the owner added it from a Euro car. You put this down if you break down in your 2.3-16 and you're waiting for that Mercedes-Benz roadside assistance station wagon to come and rescue you. The other interesting thing in here, under the floor there is a tool kit. And it doesn't just have any tools, but rather tools that say Mercedes-Benz on them. Only the finest tools will do for this vehicle. And finally, we move under the hood, where obviously the first thing you'll notice is this car's 2.3-liter 16-valve engine. Again, only 167 horsepower here in North America. The European ones had 185 horsepower, which made them a little bit quicker, but we had all sorts of emission stuff, and so it couldn't quite reach its full potential. Now, the engine itself was designed by Mercedes-Benz. It was only the heads that were designed by Cosworth, which is also the same company that gave us the Ford Escort Cosworth and some other really impressive performance cars from this era. The other interesting item up here is on the windshield, and that would be the mono wiper. This car doesn't have two windshield wipers, but rather one single wiper that covered the entire windshield. Now, the owner of this car sent me a brochure, and it talks about how the single wiper wipes more percentage of the windshield than two wipers and blah, blah, blah. It was one of these innovations that Mercedes-Benz touted as a brilliant feature. The interesting thing about the mono wiper, though, was how it operated. It wasn't just a single wiper that swung across the windshield. Instead, it extends and retracts based on where it is on the windshield to wipe the most surface possible. It actually does do a really good job of wiping the entire surface, more than cars with two wipers. It's a shame Mercedes-Benz gave this up, to be honest. And so that's a tour of the 190E 2.3-16. Now it's time to get it out on the road and drive it. All right, driving the 190E 2.3-16. Never driven one of these before. It's not unusual to find one of these with a ton of miles. The owners of these cars bought them to drive. They bought them to use, and they used them. Now, the dogleg is a little bit unusual to get used to at the very beginning. It's kind of an odd sensation to shift down and to the left to get into first, but I will say it does benefit you the second and third thing. Having second and third right in a line together does feel more natural, and it makes it easier to shift between those gears if those are gears that you're going to be in more frequently, which obviously you are in a lot of circumstances, not just on the track, but just general driving. It's actually not as slow as I was expecting. The owner, when he pulled up in it, he warned me. He's like, you might be disappointed. Actually, I don't find it to be that slow. Part of it is the sensation of speed. It's fantastic. You have giant windows everywhere, so you can see everything, and everything looks like it's coming at you real fast. You're low. You feel the road more because this is an older car, and it's not as comfortable. And so, you know, it feels like you're not going that slow. It doesn't feel insanely fast. The clutch is a little springy. It's not quite as linear as you like. But it's pretty easy and reasonable to rev match and that sort of thing. It's not all that challenging. It's not like it has a kink to it. It's just like, it's a little bit heavier than I was expecting and requires a little bit more force. The shift lever and gear action is actually pretty good. By modern standards, the throws are very long, but I've driven a lot of 80s manual cars, and actually these throws feel pretty good. I've driven Ferraris, that sort of thing, that have longer throws than this. The car actually feels like sportier and performancier than you might think, because you feel low, you feel you have a big view of the whole world because the windows are also big. You feel pretty sporty when you're driving this, even though it's not tremendously fast. I mean, 170 horsepower, even by the standards of back then, wasn't really that dramatic. Handling is actually better than I was expecting. You know, I love cars that have a lot of weight to their steering. New cars never have it, and I'm a sucker for any car that has good steering feel and doesn't feel too vague or over-assisted. And this car is that. This car has really good steering feel. Surprisingly so. It's a really nice feel when you're going around a corner. It feels reasonably well balanced. There's more body roll than I was expecting, a little bit more suspension travel than I was thinking, especially over bumps, but it actually handles it all pretty well. And when you're going around corners, it's a light car, it's a short car, it's a relatively tossable car, and it does feel that even after 30 years, and in this case, 200,000 miles. And so that's the Mercedes 190E 2.3-16, the sporty Mercedes sedan of its day, the long ago predecessor to the C63 AMG that we all know and love. It's been 30 years since this car came out, but it is still cool today. And now it's time to give it a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the 2.3-16 looks fine, not gorgeous, but nice enough, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is around 8 seconds, and that gives it a 1 out of 10. Handling is good, steering is nicely weighted, and the car is light enough that it's fun and tossable, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is decent, it's slow, and not that exciting, but it's fun enough, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and it turns some heads. It's a cool car for those who know it, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 21 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The 2.3-16 doesn't have much by modern standards, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is normal for the class, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is okay, the interior is decent, and so is reliability. None of it is amazing, but it's good enough, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is normal for the segment, even though the 2.3-16 is short of seat, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and that's the best part. These are really cheap right now, but I have to imagine they'll pick up eventually, since you can get one of these right now for around 10 grand. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 25 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 46 out of 100, which places it here against some other 1980s cars I've reviewed. Obviously, it's no Ferrari or Lamborghini or Aston Lagonda, but the 2.3-16 is pretty cool in its own right, and I'm glad I finally got to check one out.